Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this SolarPower Europe webinar on the global market outlook for solar power 2019-2023. Today, we will look at the current status, trends, and future outlook of the solar market worldwide, based on our market intelligence report, the Global Market Outlook 2019. My name is Raffaele Rossi, and I work at SolarPower Europe as a policy analyst. And I'm very much looking forward to moderate this webinar and exchanging with you. Before we begin with the webinar, a few words of housekeeping rules. If you have any questions, you should type your questions using the tool on the right-hand side of the screen, as you can see from this slide. We will try to address them at the end of the presentation. And shortly after the end of the webinar, we will share the slides and the recording of the webinar with you. The slides are already available in the handouts you can find on the right-hand side of the screen. One last remark is that our report is available for free for download on our website, so please get your copy. So today we are here with Michael Schmela, Executive Advisor at SolarPower Europe, and who is also the lead author of the Global Market Outlook 2019, who will present our findings and will answer to a few questions during the Q&A session that will follow his presentation. So Michael, I hand it over to you. You should have controls, and please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Raffaele. Greetings from SolarPower Europe. Happy you're joining us. First, I have to say a big thank you to all the supporters of the GMO. The Global Market Outlook 2019 to 2023 has really only been possible through a close cooperation with our members, that's companies active across all parts of the solar value chain from around the world, national solar and storage associations from many European countries. We are really, in particular, very thankful to the Global Solar Council and its members for providing their deep insights into their home countries, for our gigawatt markets chapters, where we basically invited the national associations from the respective countries to write about what's going on in their countries. And I'm also very thankful to Intersolar Europe for supporting the GMO now for many, many years. Agenda. So we start a little with a short or brief look into cost developments. Then we look at the global solar market. And as a European association, solar association, we will then take a step and put the microscope on the European solar market. And as lobbyists, we also want to share with you what are the solar drivers in Europe. And finally, we come to the conclusions. Okay, so in the last few global market outlooks, we always showed a cost curve. And again, to those who are active in solar for a while, that shouldn't come as a surprise. Utility scale solar is again cheaper than new conventional power generation sources, like nuclear, coal, as well as gas. We're at the same level as wind, sometimes cheaper, sometimes less cheap. But the important key takeaway here is, first of all, solar's cost is still decreasing. So if you compare this Lazar LCOE outlook from November 2018 with the one from the year before, you see a 14% year-on-year decrease in solar LCOEs. And if you look at the yellow curve, you simply obviously also see that it's still much steeper than the others. So that means further cost reduction lies ahead of us. With what we've seen in China now, is that the era of feed-in tariffs is sooner or later, rather than later, now coming to an end. And one big driver of solar will be, at least for utility scale solar auctions. And we've just collected here a couple of different auction awards in 2018. And you see the numbers vary from country to country, but what you can see that in really different regions, you have often a 2 in front of the comma. So that means we can really see that, or say that, solar increasingly is a 2 cent per kilowatt hour generation source in the utility scale space. I think what we always have to keep in mind here is when our policymakers in developing countries see that, then they say, wow, solar is so cheap, we also want to have that here. And we all know, obviously, that you need economies with stable policy conditions and high credit ratings to be able to offer such low PPAs. But the good thing is, and we've seen that also in the last few years, that international lenders have now set up really comprehensive programs that allow also emerging developing countries to come up with tenders, with solar tenders, where the awarded prices are not at that level necessarily, but close to that. So for example, if you look at the Scaling Solar program from the World Bank Group, which is probably the largest solar scheme of this kind, and which has been supporting solar deployment in African countries, in a couple of African countries so far. Recently, there was an announcement that they're expanding now to Uzbekistan as well. But there was in 2018 a tender where in Zambia actually one award was as low as 4 US cents per kilowatt hour. And in April 2019, there was in Zambia even one tender from the Get Fit program between the country's energy ministry and the German Development Bank, where 120 megawatts were awarded, and it was as low as 3.99 cents, which was a new record for sub-Saharan Africa. So in summary, prices continue to go down, often in the 2 cents or more and more in the 2 cent range, but even in new developing emerging solar countries, you can even be now in the 4 cent range and getting into the 3 cent range. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the market. First, looking back. So I think 2018 will be remembered for several reasons. So once, I think it will be recalled probably as the year solar in total reached a cumulative operational capacity of over 500 gigawatt, or half 0.5 terawatt. So that means we're really getting closer to the terawatt era. And total installed PV power capacity grew by 25% year on year. So I think we had 509 gigawatts end of 2018. The year before, it was 407 gigawatt. And if you look further back, so basically it's almost in 100 gigawatt steps. So I think in 2016 we were around 300 gigawatt, and then it went down. So I think the cost path or the growth path is now pretty impressive. If we look at the annual installations, which you see here, solar 2018 will probably be remembered as a year that for the first time the 100 gigawatt threshold was reached. But it will be also, and you see that if you compare 2017 and 2018 editions, will probably go down in history also as the year where solar took a short break for the next growth phase. So this, at least according to our research, 102 gigawatt was installed. There are a couple of analysts who are still under 100 gigawatt. There are also others like Bloomberg, which are at 708 gigawatts. So I think there's a range. Nevertheless, I think that's where we more or less are. And I think consensus is also that there was a little growth, but not a lot of growth. We have to take one thing here, and we shouldn't forget one thing when we look at the number, which might look a little bit disappointing. But when we look into mid-2018, so that when China, after they implemented their 531 restructuring of the program, I think a lot of analysts were very, very negative. And at some point, I looked at them all, and I remember that Goldman Sachs was the most conservative, and at that time they anticipated solar demand even to drop by 24% compared to 2017, and anticipated that the market would be only 75 gigawatt in 2018. So taking this into consideration, the just above 102 gigawatt is actually pretty impressive. Still, of course, it is not impressive when you look at the growth rate we've seen in 2017 and 2016, which were 30% and 50%. But if we look at the total installed capacity shares for the different regions, you can see, although the Chinese market decreased considerably in 2018, that both China and Asia continued and even increased their dominance in 2018. So if we look at Asia as a whole, so that means addition of over 70 gigawatt in 2018 resulted in a total capacity of almost 300 gigawatt of total installed capacity, which is equal to a 58% market share and a 3-point year-on-year growth. So, and if we look at only then the top 10 solar PV markets and their installed capacity in 2018, you see that China still was responsible for 1/3 of the total installed solar power fleet, ahead of Japan, India, Australia. So that means, interestingly, it's also, you see that no European country alone is in the 2-digit range anymore. So that means, although we will see that later, we are seeing now a solar renaissance in Europe, at least for the moment, the European market share continued to decrease. The good thing is that, and that was the reason why, despite China's year-on-year market decrease of 16%, actually, which is quite a bit at that size, the market did not decrease. We still had a 4% year-on-year growth in 2018. So, and the reason for that is simply that there's a market diversification. So more and more markets are coming up. So, and several of them are even becoming gigawatt scale markets. So while in 2017 we had 9 gigawatt scale markets, the number in 2018 went up to 11 gigawatts, and we forecast now that in 2019 the number will increase to 16 different gigawatt markets. Actually, if you would take the time and look into all the different countries we're listing there for 2019, you would miss one, and that's Vietnam. So it's still in our rest of the world countries, but the feed-in tariff in Vietnam has really driven a lot of installations, a couple of gigawatts already in the first half year, which shows actually that how quickly things can change and how quickly markets can become really big markets these days. Let's look not only into 2019, but let's look beyond that. So in our 5-year market forecast, we always show 3 different scenarios: a low scenario, which you see in orange, the high scenario, the optimistic scenario in yellow, and our most realistic scenario is this gray line. The gray bars are the historical data. And what we forecast in our medium scenario is that the market would grow 25% this year, from 102 gigawatts to 128 gigawatts. The spread to the low and the high scenario is pretty big, so our low scenario, for example, which really models major markets to cut their solar support, estimates only 84.5 gigawatts. Obviously, this outcome is pretty highly unlikely when taking into account solar activities around the globe in the last, the research took place until May, in the last few, or in the first few months of the year. However, a lot will obviously depend on China. So again, we won't end up at 84, but if we end up at 128, which we forecasted in April, really remains to be seen, because in the end, all depends on China. And in the first 6 months of the year, very few PV was installed in China. The regulations are now mostly out, but the market has not really kickstarted now. So now everyone's saying it will be Q3, when it's super busy Q4. But we have to see if really everything will be installed in Q4, or something will be of that only grid connected in Q1. So it's still too early to forecast where the market will end up in the end. Anyway, so what we can still say is solar's attractive value proposition will for sure lead to 2-digit growth rates globally in the next few years. And so we think that even if China comes not back in Q3 strong, but in Q4, that the Chinese market is then ready for a much larger growth phase, and can really absorb soon capacities of 50 gigawatts and more again. If we are, or maybe, yeah, oops, one step back. Yeah, so what I just wanted to say is actually, if you look until 2023, so we anticipate actually the market to grow to an annual level of 180 gigawatt in 2023. So, which is quite impressive. If we look at total installed capacities, you can simply see that according to our 5-year scenario, we will, in our realistic scenario, with an average 2-digit growth rate over the next 5 years, end up at, again, that's our medium scenario, at around 1.3 gigawatts. Under optimal conditions that could go up to 1.6 gigawatts. But even in our in the most negative scenario we modeled, we will still exceed the terawatt level in 2023. So in our realistic scenario now, we assume that the terawatt level will be reached in 2022. But in the most optimistic scenario, it could be actually already in 2021. So in general, we would say that if you look here at the top 20 markets, I think you can take a look at the numbers once you've downloaded the presentation. But what I just want to show here is you simply see the total capacities installed in the left column, and then actually what's important is also the new capacities. That's the medium column that we anticipate for over the next 5 years. And in the end, then look at the symbols. So in general, we think that that for basically all leading countries, the prospects are pretty sunny. So we see 3 somewhat cloudy countries: Japan, which is still in a transition phase. So that means the market will more or less go down. I think there might be soon a peak, which will stop a little bit this continuous decrease for the last few years, simply because the feed-in tariffs will come to an end. But then we also somewhat negative, or more negative on Mexico now with the new government, which at least on the utility scale side favors now rather fossil fuels than lower cost and renewable energies. Pakistan is also a bit blurry what to expect there, and in the end, I think it's Turkey, where we have this financial crisis, and which looked very promising 2 years ago, but is now pretty disappointing. If we look at Europe, then we can also just concede 2018 was really a great year for solar in Europe. So the continent as a whole added 11.3 gigawatts compared to 9.3 gigawatts. So that's a 21% market increase. If you look only at the EU 28 countries, then demand even soared by 37% from 6 gigawatt in 2017 to 8.2 gigawatt. And there's a reason why the EU is so much better than Europe. Traditionally, the global market outlook includes Turkey and the Turkish installations also for Europe. You can probably also count them to Asia. So traditionally, we do it the other way around. And since the Turkish market has dropped considerably year on year, that's why the market growth for the EU is much more pronounced than for Europe as a whole. If we look at total installed capacities, it's the pattern or the picture is similar to what we've seen in 2017. Germany, which was also on an annual basis the largest country again in 2018 with 3 gigawatts installed, remains also Europe's largest market. So the total solar power operation fleet was around 46 gigawatts end of 2018. And the second largest country, you see that in orange, is Italy. Although Italy actually has seen a rather slow market growth in the last few years, so in the 400, 500, 600 megawatt range. It still continued since its heydays in 2011. One of the biggest market and still in Europe, and still has 19 or has still a big share. So Italy has 20 gigawatt installed, or 19.9 end of last year, and that translated into a market share of 16%. Germany had 37%. So that means if you add that up, these two countries alone had 52% market share in Europe. It's slightly going down by around 2.5 percentage points year on year, but still 2 countries alone in Europe operate more than half of the power generation, solar power generation fleet. In fact, there was only one other country, also not so much going on, and as of recently, that's the UK, that had installed more than 10 gigawatts. So basically, you have only 3 countries that have each installed more than 10 gigawatts in solar so far. Yeah, looking at the outlook for the next 5 years, again, we see strong growth for Europe. We had 11.3 gigawatts in 2018, and the number looks really impressive and hard to believe, but it's very likely that we go there, we get there, so that the market will really grow by over 80% year on year to 20 gigawatts in 2019. And we also anticipate another 2-digit market growth rate for 2019, when we expect the market to be 24 gigawatts. And then we see a somewhat slower growth rate in 2021, and then it's going up a little again. So, but in 2023, according to our we anticipate realistic scenario, could be as big as 30 gigawatts. So if we look at total installed capacities, that would mean that if our medium scenario came true, total installed solar capacity would increase from 126 gigawatts to 255 gigawatts in 2023. Here we've also done that, what we've done for the global top 20, we've done that here for the European top 15. Simply looked at how the political support prospects are, and again, Turkey, we see negative rainy outlook, while the only countries where we are we see a little bit of a cloudy outlook are the UK and Russia. So I think UK has now probably met its trough and it's going up again. So our colleagues from the British associations, SPA, are very optimistic on the British market. And Russia, taking its huge size into consideration, it's pretty disappointing what was happening so far there. But also there, we see that the market could actually be a 400 to 500 megawatt market in the next few years. So all in all, actually very positive what we see in Europe. What I would like to do now is, since we're a European association, I would like to share you, especially now that the European market, that Europe is back on the solar map again, what the drivers are and why we believe that the market will be so strong and grow so quickly, especially over the next 2 years. So I think on this slide, this is from Eurostat, and it simply shows the number of EU countries that have not reached their 2020 renewable energy targets, these are national binding targets, which they simply have to meet. And these countries are now really speeding up. And the reason, I say, so for example, we've seen Spain actually very strong in the last few, or at least the tenders very strong, the installations are taking place now, is really these binding targets. And this will drive, or will be a major driver over the next 2 years for solar in the European Union. Simply because solar is now so cheap and it's very easy to deploy, easy and fast to deploy. That's why several of the countries will kind of do a sort of solar spurt until 2020. Beyond that, what will be a great support for solar in the until 2030 is our clean energy package, so which was recently finalized. So everything, all the different directives as part of this comprehensive clean energy legislation are now passed. And there's a very strong governance which really requires countries or the European Union to reach 32% or at least 32% of EU energy consumption by 2030 to come from renewables. That was a big win for us, because the proposal only 2, 3 years ago was still 27%. And so it's actually much closer to the 35% we had asked for, and we are very happy with that. So there's of course no breakdown what has to be solar, and there's even not at the moment. The national countries, the member states, have to really work on their targets, how they want to reach that. So still an important lobbying phase for us. But if you would assume that solar would want to reach a 10% share in electricity demand, that would translate into 320 gigawatt of solar, a bit too conservative, as we've also shown what we expect to happen already until 2023, when over 250 gigawatt could be installed. We think much more likely is actually, although that's much more likely is simply a 20% share, and that's quite ambitious, but it is achievable, and it would then mean 640 to 650 gigawatt of installed solar by 2030. But especially with the recent push and movement here with Fridays for Future in Europe, I think if it comes to climate change, or the climate crisis as it is called now, everything is possible. What we're also seeing in Europe now is that with the low cost of solar, corporates taking renewables increasingly serious. And here is a slide you can see that's an old slide from early from 2018, I believe still, where from Bloomberg New Energy Finance, what they've seen in terms of corporate PPAs. Most of that took place in the US so far, and most of that was wind. But again, also here, this clean energy package is helping. It will help to remove several administrative barriers and clarification, especially on issuing guarantees of origins, so that that we are seeing now more corporate PPAs in solar coming in Europe and be a big driver. Europe has been for the past always also a big market for distributed generation. Again, the clean energy package helps us a lot. So what hampered, killed basically rooftop solar in Spain is not possible anymore. So there will be no sun tax model for self-consumption possible in Europe anymore. We will also have a binding priority dispatch for small or for residential and commercial rooftop installations, and there are different supporting phrases actually in the legislations that really support and will help unlock the business model for active customers and citizen energy communities. We also see that that digitalization and storage are also key for the next growth phase, especially in those countries where you have already some quite some distributed solar installed. Storage obviously will help, and with this clean energy package, peer-to-peer trading will be possible. I think there will be no double taxation for storing energy, and there will be also a competitive framework for storage ownership, which simply means that that owners of grids actually can own storage only in certain cases, and if it is really competitive. Yeah, then I think what's also important for us is here in Europe is the path to grid intelligent solar. The message is here very clear: utility scale solar supports grid reliability, and we lobby clearly for saying Europe needs both small scale and large scale solar as the lowest cost variant of solar power. So in this clean energy package, there were also strong regulatory provisions to prevent distortions from capacity remuneration mechanisms. These can be only temporary and implemented only following thorough assessments by the Commission. This will also open quite some opportunities for solar. And what's also important is that solar generation shall continue to be curtailed simply as a last resort, and then also fully compensated in case there's non-market-based redispatch. Coming to the conclusions, what we always do is we look at our forecasts from the year before, and again, our global market outlook 2019 was more optimistic than what we forecasted in 2018. I think we're probably not alone with this. Unfortunately, everyone has underestimated the potential and growth of solar in the short term, and for sure also in the long run. And I think this is also an important message which we simply have to convey, that that solar is basically ready to grow much faster, and we should show that it is ready. While we often, of course, now can say, and several people know it already now, that solar is the lowest cost of power generation, you can see on this slide that solar is also the technology which is the most successful one in terms of capacity additions. And that is true for any other technology. Solar installed twice as much as wind in 2018. We installed twice as much as coal in 2018. We installed even more, even if it was only very slightly more, more than all fossil fuels and nuclear together. So if you look at that, so on the one hand, solar being the lowest or often the lowest cost alternative, and solar also now being successful, one could say, okay, cool, we're there. But if you look at the next slide, then you simply see that that there's still a lot of potential if we put it positively, because market share of solar power was only 2.2%, and even renewables as a whole were just a quarter. So that means we're just at the beginning, and I think both IEA and IRENA came recently up with some alarming numbers. So I think IRENA said in order to meet the Paris targets, we need basically to install 400 gigawatts of renewable power capacity in average per year until 2050. So if you look at solar being at around 100 and all renewables together at around 180, we are at less than 50% of what's needed, or we were less at that level last year, and there's simply the message we have to say: solar is cheap, solar is flexible, solar is variable, solar is versatile, and that's why solar has to grow much faster. That was my final words as a lobbyist, and I would like to open this webinar now for questions, which Raffaele will moderate. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Michael. Thank you for a very insightful and informative presentation. I think it caught a lot of interest, and I'm looking at the amount of questions that we are being asked. I think there will be time to address some of them. So let's try to start from the beginning. We have one question about China. So how do you see the Chinese market evolving after the full restructuring of its solar program, and when do you expect it to be finalized?
Okay, I was expecting that one, so I had already one slide actually in reserve. Can you maybe go to that slide? Yeah, okay. So I would like to show you this slide. Actually, it's not from us, it's from CPIA, the China Photovoltaic Industry Association. And it's part of our gigawatt chapter where the national associations contributed their views. Ours is similar, a bit different, but similar. But what you can simply see here that from the 44 gigawatt that was installed in 2018, they believe in the most optimistic scenario that that the market could be 45 gigawatt this year, and then they're more in the low scenario that will be 35. So our assumption was basically a stagnation for 2019, and we anticipated 43 gigawatt. I think that was a bit too optimistic, at least as it looks for the moment, because the market has not come back. I think the necessary policy framework conditions are done, but it is still not clear which of the subsidy-free systems, where they will be built, and it will turn out to be a bit more complicated, obviously, than just in feed-in tariff times, adding up the system or installing the systems, and then getting the feed-in tariff, even if it was 1 or 1.5 year delayed. Here you have to, of course, involve a couple of entities, the municipality, the grid operator, and obviously, the Chinese government tries to make it as easy as possible. They are also setting up financing schemes. But again, we're at the start, so I wouldn't be surprised if the market will be really 35 to 39 gigawatts this year. But I think the 35 we should reach. And once actually everything is going, the market will come back. But again, it is complicated. So even the sort of, except for the poverty alleviation program, all feed-in tariffs have basically certain caps. So you have to bid now on everything. And that simply takes time. And the players have to look at it, actually how much it makes sense for them to participate, where and when. So China will come back, and I agree with our colleagues from CPIA that it will continue also to grow, and you see they are pretty optimistic that in 2023 it could be even as big as 70 gigawatt, but it's too early to say actually how big it will be.
Thanks, Michael. Before moving on to the next question, I would like to address a couple of practical questions that are being asked at the moment. So first of all, once again, the presentation is available in the handouts that you can find on your right-hand side of the screen, and the recording will be shared after the end of the webinar. Other question regard the data sheets. So the data sheets on which these reports and presentation are based are available for all members of SolarPower Europe and will be distributed in a few weeks, so during the month of July. So this on the practical aspects. We have one question about the role of solar in relation to other renewables such as wind in the decarbonization of the global energy system. Do you see any opportunities for cooperation and synergies?
Yes, I think it's really important. Obviously, there is some competition between the two technologies, but we need both because they are, to a large extent, obviously complementary depending on the region. But in general, you need both. But what we will see, of course, and that's interesting, if really 20 gigawatts, as we anticipate, will be installed this year, so small solar brother will become, at least in Europe, the big brother compared to wind. So I think the shares, the dimensions will change here a little bit, but what we see, and the question is also how it will be in tenders. Will the European Commission, for example, favors technology neutral tenders? Certain regions you have technology specific tenders. Germany is now coming up with an so-called innovation tender where you are able also to bid with hybrid power plants, including storage. I think that's probably the way to go. Basically developers and IPPs should come up with intelligent solutions so that solar, wind, and storage can be installed as close as possible to load centers, and then offer also ancillary services.
Thank you. I'm trying to cluster some questions that are addressing the same topic, which is something that you just mentioned, which is storage. So the questions regard what about the storage market, and can you say a few words on the evolution of the storage market in relation to solar, and whether this is happening at any scale, so both behind the meter as well as utility scale? Thanks.
Okay, we haven't covered storage in detail in this report. We also represent a number of storage companies at SolarPower Europe, and we have a storage task force. So I don't want to go into details. Storage market is coming, and especially now with corporate power sourcing and solar competing, or solar also becoming actually a bigger player in the merchant space. This will drive solar on the utility side of things, and it will continue also on the residential side. In Germany, for example, which is probably the biggest storage market these days, many of the solar systems are residential solar systems are directly being built with storage, simply because the absolute amounts are not so big anymore. Again, I think a key driver for storage to grow is the clean energy package. What needs to be done now, of course, that the clean energy package is passed, that all this, especially in Europe, this legislation has to be turned also into national regulations, and here some time and efforts might be still needed, but in general, I think storage will play a big role and will be also important for the further growth of solar, in particular in Europe, but in other countries as well.
Thanks. We have a few questions about segmentation. So first of all, maybe I can address that the data that we are providing regards only solar PV, so no CSPs included in that. And it does indeed cover different segments. The question for you, Michael, is, have you got any details about the system size that will be installed in 2019, meaning the split between residential, commercial, and utility?
Okay, actually, we're just working on that at the moment for the member data, which are supposed to go out in early July. And I think it obviously depends from country to country. If you look at Spain, all of the 4 gigawatts actually that are anticipated, or almost all, will be utility scale systems. So that means wherever you have tenders and the systems have to be installed, that will be all utility scale. In Holland, for example, it's different because on the one hand you have this very attractive auction program for large scale systems. On the other hand, you have a pretty stable residential and commercial market. It really depends here, really from country to country, because it depends on residential electricity prices, commercial electricity prices. Here I would actually really prefer to point to our data, which we will provide soon. In general, obviously, I still think there is worldwide a trend to larger systems. You see that in all countries, that auctions are driving large systems. Corporates are also preferring large systems. We have in the next 2 years also there's still the boom in Australia, where the market is on the one hand, of course, very strong on the residential level. Every 5th house has now a solar system, but a lot of the growth, especially this year and last year and this year, will be big systems. Yeah.
Great. Since you mentioned Spain, you mentioned the Netherlands, there are questions regarding what are going to be the next big countries leading the solar electricity transition in Europe. So what are the most promising EU countries in the next 4 or 5 years? There are questions specifically on Portugal, for instance, which has currently a quite low install capacity, but it seems to be quite promising in the future.
Yeah, I think so. Portugal, we also see there's quite a pipeline actually now, and that needs to be installed. I think so. With Spain driving now beyond actually the auction-based systems, also merchant solar, we will also see that increasingly in Portugal taking place. I think So we still, I think Spain will, in our forecast, be the largest market this year in Europe, ahead of Germany, which we consider to reach also 4 gigawatt. But there will be, yeah, and I think in the medium run, Spain will probably stay there. We all, well, many people know about this 30 gigawatt PPA pipeline in Spain. We have to see how much of that will be installed, when that will be installed. Our colleagues from the Spanish Association UNEF show a slide where they see a linear growth every year from 3 gigawatts. That's nice. If it would be that way, I would assume that we see also some bumps again, because we cannot really control that. Of course, grid constraints are there in Spain, or grid connection is an issue, but we'll see. Other promising countries in Europe, at least in the short run, is really, for example, Hungary has still a pipeline from over 1 gigawatt, which needs to be built. Was close to 500 megawatt last year, also very attractive this year. Ukraine has been a very attractive market at the moment still. We have to see what the new government does. But all countries in Europe are growing. So depending on in which segment one is active, the target countries should be different. But yeah, I think you can hardly do anything wrong if you're active in Europe these days.
Thanks. We have a question about sector coupling, I believe. The industry needs power around the clock and in huge dimensions. How can this be done? What is the solar role in this?
Again, I didn't get that.
So the industrial sector needs power around the clock and in huge dimension. What is the role of solar within this context?
Yeah, that's part of solar is simply part of hybrid power plants with storage, which will play a key role. And we got to get really the heavy industry in at some point. It will be then also hydrogen at some point. That's simply the way to go.
Okay, thanks. I think we're running out of time. We have time maybe for one last question. So I think we can discuss something that we haven't really addressed so far, except partly in one slide, Michael, which is corporate PPAs. So we saw a certain degree of growth also in the EU, but what are the typical barriers for corporate PPAs in the EU, and what is the outlook for the future?
Yeah, I think the best place to learn about corporate PPAs is our resource event, which will take place in beginning of October in Amsterdam, where you can learn everything about PPAs, which we do together with Wind Europe and RE100. But in general, in the past, actually, the issue were on regulations, and if you looked at solar in particular, actually the solar systems were often simply too small. You know, in Germany, you had in the auctions a cap of 10 megawatts. That's not of real interest. We corporates often, especially the bigger corporates, want to have access to larger amounts and bigger power plants. We're seeing that now with solar being so cheap, and that when we have larger power plants, that we will see also solar playing a much bigger role. And again, in France and in Germany has been also an issue with guarantees of origin. Corporates need the guarantees of origin on the one hand to prove that they that they buy renewable power, and on the other hand, they would also would like to be able to trade that. And in the German and the French government, put some barriers in the way, so it was not possible. So that means in two big markets, actually, where you have a lot of corporates, that was not possible so far. Again, I think that's changing. The right signals are coming from Brussels. They have to be implemented also on a national level, but in the next few years, we consider corporate power sourcing as an important driver for solar growth.
Okay, thanks. Now, 3 minutes past 4. I think it's time to wrap this up. So I would like to thank you for sharing your knowledge and insights, and for all attendees to be participating in this webinar. Before we conclude, I understand that you wouldn't like to say a few words about some of our upcoming events. You already mentioned the resource event, but please, I leave the floor to you to wrap it up.
Yeah. I think we will do two events. One is the resource event, where it's really about corporate power sourcing, more about bigger power plants, and we have another event which will take place in Brussels in November, and that's where we will really address the new distributed energy world, solar and storage. We will talk about artificial sector coupling, solar mobility. So whatever is needed actually in the new energy world. We will also have a second edition of our startup awards. So you're invited to join us and learn with us more about digital solar and storage.
Okay, with this, I thank you again for your participation and attendance and interest, and thank you again, Michael, and hope to see you soon at our upcoming events. Thank you very much.